I'm Professor Suzanne Kim. I know a number of you already, and some are new, pleasantly new faces. And I am the founder and the director of the Rutgers Center for Gender, Sexuality, Law, and Policy. And I welcome you to our conversation today with Hannah Pennington, who is also one of our alums, as we know, and is on the advisory board for the center. And it's wonderful, really wonderful to have her here today. So Hannah Pennington is the Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Training at the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, formerly known as the Office to Combat Domestic Violence. And previously, Hannah served as the office's Director of Policy, and before that, she was the Executive Director of the Manhattan Family Justice Center. Hannah came to the Mayor's Office from from Sanctuary for Families, where she was the director of the agency's Bronx Legal Project, housed at the Bronx Family Justice Center. She started her legal career at private practice, if that's something people should ask her about, as an associate at Du Bois & Plimpton in New York City, where she worked on various commercial litigations and government investigations for over 7 years. She, as I mentioned, is a graduate of this law school, having graduated in 2001, and Cornell University School of Industrial Relations. While Hannah was here at Rutgers, she co-founded the Domestic Violence Advocacy Project and secured a federal Violence Against Women Act grant to fund the program. And so Hannah, we will be in conversation about making an impact through policy leadership. We're also very pleased to be joined by our Dean David Lopez, who everybody knows here, who joined us this past August, and he was the longest-serving general counsel of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He worked most recently as a partner at Bowman Golden in Washington, D.C., and is a nationally recognized expert in civil rights and employment law. He earned his undergraduate degree, magna cum laude, from Arizona State University and his JD from Harvard Law School, where he has lectured. During his time at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, he acted as the lead lawyer for the nation's primary administrative agency charged with enforcing federal employment anti-discrimination laws. So this is a wonderful opportunity. The idea for this actually comes from numerous conversations that I have had over the years with students as well as graduates of this institution about how actually to translate your legal education into making an impact through policy work and policy leadership. And Hannah is a real mentor on this, and we've had numerous conversations about this issue. So we thought that this would be a great opportunity to really extend out some of the educational pieces of the work that we do here in general at the law school and through the center, to talk a little bit more specifically about how you can make an impact and how she has done so well. So I'm going to actually sit down so we can have a more conversational approach. And but before that, I wanted, because Dean Lopez actually does need to speak off soon, and we're really fortunate to have a few minutes of his time, to David, if you might share a little bit, some thoughts that you might have about the ways in which you have made an impact in policy leadership, and some thoughts you might have for students and other guests.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure. This, of course, is the latest in a long series of excellent programming by the Rutgers Center for Gender, Sexuality, Law, and Policy. And of course, today we're going to be discussing a very critical and important issue, and I think we have the right person to do it. One of the things that you learn living in Washington, D.C. For a good chunk of my career is that there are a lot of lawyers there. But they're not like the LA law types of lawyers, law and order type lawyers, that there are lawyers, I think I would even say probably a majority of the lawyers working there are not working in either a litigation or a formal transactional capacity, that they're working in a legislative and advocacy capacity. And it's a tremendously critical skill, and it's difficult. And I think that if you study any social change movement in this country, you will see the advocates on the ground pressing the issues, articulating the issues, raising public awareness, public consciousness about the critical issues of our day, forming coalitions, working the politics on the ground. And I think it's fair to say that some of the best lawyers I've met have operated in that capacity for many of the civil rights advocacy groups in Washington, the national groups, on just a whole range of issues, from gender equality to LGBT rights to voting rights. And so I was really excited to see this program, because I really think that it's important for us to really present to all of you the opportunities that are available in this area. I think this is a good opening to do that. I would definitely be willing to talk to any of you if you have ideas and want to get into this field of advocacy. I think what's important to remember is that it really is, in many respects, some of the same skills that you're learning in your sort of litigation or transactional-oriented class, because what it is advocacy, coalitions, persuasiveness, interpersonal skills, research, preparedness, and hard work. And so I would definitely encourage you all to kind of explore these opportunities at any level. And I know that we were talking about how Hannah worked as on a legislative staff in Washington. That's another alternative at either the state or local level that you should consider. And again, it is an opportunity to use, I think, many of the wonderful skills that you're learning here. So I'm glad to hear. And I'll listen in for a little bit and have to speak out.
Great, thank you so much. Hannah, can you just tell us a little bit, I think just to get us oriented about some of the work that you do at the mayor's office and how it connects up with what it means to do policy work?
Sure. Well, first I want to say I asked Professor Kim if she told everybody it was an event just for women, but she said no, and then I saw that you were here, so I figured it was. Sorry, this is like the story of my life, so I always have to point it out.
We need to get the allies
We
involved.
do, we really do.
Right, instead of everybody just talking to same folks all the time.
Right,
Yeah.
So I can go recruit.
Okay, thank you.
I was like thinking the same thing,
Yeah.
But you know what's really funny? So I was doing this, speaking on the CLE panel the other night, that was not about anything gender related. It was about income-based legal assistance and access to justice, and almost the whole panel was women too. This seems so strange.
Yeah.
I did notice, yes.
Well, I think it's probably a common observation in the civil rights community that it's, at this point, easily the majority of women in that community.
Yeah.
Which,
So that was
another conversation.
Yeah, when it wasn't a very welcoming way to start, because I didn't mean to say I'm not glad you're here, because I'm very glad you're all here. And I'm always really excited to come back to Rutgers, which I try to do as much as I can and have been doing more so in the last few years, which is really gratifying to me. The name of our office, and there are a few people in the room who knew when it had a different name, it just happened in September, so it's actually a really exciting time for us, and actually a great example of advocacy. I've been with the mayor's office in its previous iteration since late 2012, and I would say it took about 3 years through the team members that I work with and our general counsel and deputy commissioner to advocate for a pretty big policy change in renaming our office and expanding our mission. So the Office to Combat Domestic Violence is actually a city charter mandated office. And what that means is that the New York City voted in 2001 actually to create an office dedicated exclusively to the coordination of the delivery of services around public education campaigns, education and prevention, a whole host of things. And the city voted to do that, which was really innovative in 2001, that a city would put funding behind the creation of such an office. And the office has accomplished a ton in that since that time. I would say the first phase of our work, which was during the the very long Bloomberg administration, was building up our family justice centers, which some of you may know about, which is really our sort of the how we came to our coordination of service delivery, which is the creation of OneStop Shops for survivors and their families. Took a lot of advocacy and a lot of funding from a lot of different governmental bodies, and we now have 5, one in each borough, which is really exciting. We've built up our outreach programming. When I came on board from the Family Justice Center, which is my first stint with the mayor's office, and built up the policy and training work, we, for the first time, had dedicated staff doing training and policy work, which I'll talk more as we go along around what I see as policy work. And then in doing that, we really knew, and we always knew, that first of all, we always did work outside of domestic violence. People are not simple. All of us are complicated, so are survivors. And so many of us have survived so many different kinds of harms in our lives. And we already, and I can say this as someone who advocated for survivors in family court and in civil court, it was so common that people were facing different issues. So we already were doing that work. We already did serve sex trafficking victims, for example, elder abuse victims at our family justice centers. But we wanted to do something big, and we wanted to make that really known to the world, that we want to encompass that city commitment, the whole spectrum of gender-based violence, which we left it particularly vague in what ended up happening is we didn't do it by legislation. At this point, we did it through executive order, which the mayor signed in September. And right now, I'd say the priorities of that expansion is the continuation of our work around intimate partner violence, but also very specifically trafficking work, which there was no city agency that took on the court. A lot of work happening, but no office that was the sort of responsible party in coordinating all the good works or the gaps that we needed to address. Stalking is another priority area. Sexual violence, which of course we did a lot of work in that area. There's such an incredible overlap with intimate partner violence and sexual violence. But again, we weren't doing that work when it wasn't tied to intimate partner violence. Female genital mutilation, even just since the expansion, the city council had the first hearing on that issue. So it provides us with a platform and an opportunity to do what we did with intimate partner violence, which is to, we haven't done it yet, and it's really overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that we can, over time, identify those gaps, identify innovative programming that we can develop in the city and we can fund, and we can find funding for it, which is what we've done with intimate partner violence. And I would say that it was a long process because, and this relates to what you were talking about around advocacy. You have explaining to press people or comms people, no offense, that if that's not the work they do, what do you mean the Office to End Gender-Based Violence? People don't always know what we're talking about. So it took a lot of explaining and also explaining why it should be that long formal title. There were different iterations, like the Office to Help and I was like, no, we want to name it, we want to, so we went back and forth. But it was a lot of advocacy, and that was just to name an office. And we were happy where we landed, and we wanted to keep domestic violence specifically in the name, and we didn't want to lose that, but we also wanted to keep domestic violence in the name because another sort of interesting or confusing thing about our work, and folks who have done this work know, is that really domestic violence often, people think we mean intimate partner violence when we say domestic violence, understandably, because the national movement, international movement to end domestic violence is very heavily focused on intimate partner violence. But technically, in most jurisdictions, domestic violence means all forms of family violence and intimate partner violence. And that's certainly what it means in New York City. So it could be violence between an adult child and their parent. It could be two siblings. And family violence is actually something that doesn't get a lot of attention through programming or services, and so we really wanted to make sure we front and center kept domestic violence in there. And the other sort of interesting debate is what around that was, not wanting to exclude folks from the space who didn't see all forms of intimate partner violence as gender-based violence. And we could like spend a whole nother class session or other time together debating that.
Right.
Because some people would say like, well, of course, all intimate partner violence is rooted in gender-based violence, but others wouldn't agree. We didn't want to exclude people from the space. So that is where we are, and I would say my work right now, the policy piece, which I want to talk about in terms of what I sort of define that as an attorney, comes a lot simpler to me, and the dean is right. Before going to law school, I worked in Washington, and then a couple of years ago, I was like, oh, right, I wanted to start my career. I started my whole career after college wanting to do this work, and I've like come full circle. Now I work in a government setting again. But the newer part for me is the training, which has been really fulfilling and exciting, and also requires a lot of the same skills that you build as a litigator or as an attorney. But it's really gratifying because it's around, especially the prevention end of it. Of course, on intervention, helping people better engage with people who may have experienced these things, or who want to advocate for people is really exciting. But working with young people and helping to support people who are going out to communities and to schools, and to actually think about how we can shift culture down the road to actually take on that very lofty goal of ending. That was another big debate in the name. Like, do you really want to say you're going to end all domestic and gender-based violence? So that's been a really exciting part of my work. And I'm not, at this point, we are still building up all of this. It's a pretty new thing. We created what we coined the Policy and Training Institute less than 4 years ago, and I wouldn't say it out loud until someone who works for me finally said, well, you just have to say it because that will make it. I felt like we had to have like the perfect thing. We still don't have the perfect thing, but we now have a staff of over 25 people, which is pretty, if anybody told me, when I was in law school that there would be a Policy and Training Institute for this issue with over 25 people in New York City, I would never have imagined it, so.
Well, you helped to make this happen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's the mandate of the office has expanded. There's so much in your portfolio. The work is so ambitious and obviously so crucial. I mean, how do you conceptualize what it means to do policy work? And how do you also think about the different components of the work that you do in relation to one another and in relation to yourself as a lawyer?
Yeah, so I actually have an annoying answer to the question.
Okay.
Because I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And we talk about it all the time. And I say that because just today I was in an interview, a second round interview with someone who wants to join our team as a policy advisor. And their question to me and the other leadership members that were there was like, well, what do you think? How do you think? And I didn't plant it because I knew I was coming to talk to all of you. I really think if you look across especially in New York City, I can't speak for other places quite as much, but I'm sure the same is true. The director of policy, a policy analyst, a policy advisor looks different almost in every single space because it can mean so many different things. It could literally mean a legislative advisor. In my office, we actually have a very, very tiny legislative affairs team, as in like one person who works with our general counsel who does like 5 different things. She needs like an intergov person, which would be the person who can do that legislative work across city agencies. So it literally could be just that. But it could also, I like to think about it in terms of sort of those bigger P policies, which really could be federal, state, local legislation, to smaller P policy, which could be internal to an organization. I mean, one thing that our newer policy team is working on is creating consistency in how we talk about these issues, and creating agreed upon definitions of all the types of gender-based violence, which sounds like, of course, that would be easy. It's actually not an easy thing to do,
right.
And requires looking at the penal code in New York State, how the UN defines it. It's actually, that's a complicated process. So, even internally thinking about that, I think I see that as policy work. And then I think that, there's so many different ways that policy comes to play in a place like New York City. It could literally be the protocol not working for families who are entering the homeless system, and being sort of a technical assistance provider as the experts in this area to city agencies who are doing that work. We do a lot of that. It could be, right now, we spent the last month or so, I'm sure a lot of you know about the Secretary DiBlasio's proposed regulations around how we should respond to sexual assault on college campuses, but also getting less attention is how we do it in K through 12 settings. And so the idea of the city of New York making a comment, which we did, took a really long time. So many city agencies, Department of Education has 1 million school children. They're sort of like, pretend like they don't belong in New York. They're not part of city government. We have to be like, actually, you are part of the city government. But their work is so hard because they have 1 million school children. So, I mean, I could go on and on. It could really, it could be what you want it to look like. It could also be, it could be more of like a community organizing type policy.
Right.
It could be bringing community members. We just created a new task force around community-driven solutions, which may not seem like policy, but it is, because it's creating the blueprint of like, how do we address this issue? That's the policy, even if it's not like a formal policy. And then the really kind of out there one that's come up more recently that's been so exciting is integrating art into the work that people do in all the departments that I talked about, and using art-based practices, which is really not a lawyer thing at all. But again, it goes towards advocacy. It's sort of, how do we get this work done and coming up with solutions? That's what lawyers are supposed to do. So I do see a connection.
I think, because I have to leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can continue the
I'll see
conversation.
you later.
Okay. But with regard to this work, there's such a diversity of the kinds of things that you do personally and that your office does. How does it connect up with the career path that you've taken and the types of law jobs that you had previously? Can you tell us a little bit about your path and the connections between the direct service work, the law firm work, the kind of work you do now?
Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of woke up one day recently, I was like, oh right, I wanted to work in government, I forgot about that. So that happens on career paths, where you just kind of go and then you wake up one day and you're like, start to look at it, And I would say, I do see obviously some threads through that work, doing work in Washington, and I was passionate about a number of issues. My undergraduate degree was in industrial and labor relations, which sounds a little more specific than it is, because it really was a space where students who wanted to look at policy work and look at social justice work ended up, and a lot of people who want to be lawyers, that's for sure. It was a very pre-law oriented program at my university. And that it made sense that a lot of people, went to law school right away or went corporate to do like organizational behavior. Like, I clearly knew I wasn't gonna do that, and wanted to sort of root my path in advocacy. And that was my plan when I got to Rutgers, which I did, but I also, which I think relates to where I ended up as well, I realized a real, and I think we've talked about this, but a real gap in supporting not the gray instead of the black and white. I felt like when I got to law school, it was like, you're either public interest or you're private. And there were no outlets for people who wanted to explore both, which is actually a really big reason why DVAP came about, because because there aren't, and I don't know the ins and outs as much, it was quite some time ago, but if you wanted to do a clinic, there were other things you couldn't do. And so what about like a middle ground where you could do something like a clinic and start to get a feel of pro bono public interest work when you're a law student? There weren't that many opportunities. So I do think that, and then, I clerked, which happened last minute because I couldn't get a public interest job because they were very competitive. There were less of them. I'm sure it's still very competitive, but I ended up clerking for an amazing judge on the New Jersey Supreme Court, which One thing that, by the way, that the dean forgot is writing in advocacy, which is where I really honed my writing skills when you have to write like 100-page bench memos. And then I still couldn't get my public interest job, so I went to the firm I had summered at, which was Debevoise, which is was a wonderful place to kind of grow more of that public-private piece of what was interesting to me, because I obviously did a lot of commercial work. I was there for almost 8 years, but I also had an opportunity to do a couple things. One, to do direct service work in a public interest capacity through my pro bono work, and I had a lot of support and mentorship around that, which is something I'm really grateful for. But I also had an opportunity in a big organization to get involved in different different committees that were trying to change that organization, which I think was, if it wasn't that kind of space, I feel like I would have missed the opportunity to grow those skills, which I'm still using now, because I'm advocating to grow, our small agency, which is pretty small, under 100 for New York City, but then also sort of how do we advocate to change different policies and procedures, even just within city government. So I definitely think there's some threads there.
What did you really draw on, or what do you think you've drawn on most from your legal education throughout this really interesting and high impact path that you've taken?
I guess I would say a couple things. One, I think you need to be able to be someone who's able to speak up and speak out, which I was always nervous to. I'm still nervous to do it, but I was really nervous to do it in law school, but I did it all the time. I always say I was like the person who raised my hand all the time, and I bet like on the outside people thought like, she's like so confident, but every time I raised my hand, I got nervous and like got a stomachache, but I still did it, So, and I don't know, would I have done that if I wasn't in law school in a different space? Who knows, I think it was I think it was helpful that I was in a law school environment, because that was sort of expected, that you're gonna, hone some public speaking skills. I think that lawyers, and I definitely got this in my corporate experience, are pretty meticulous and careful. And I'm actually losing some of that now because I have a general counsel and I don't have to wear my lawyer hat all the time. And sometimes I'm like, well, you're my lawyer, like, help me. But but all kidding aside, I do think that is a really helpful thing. And even if you're not, if you're editing a memo that's going to go to City Hall to, advocate for something, it needs to be well written and it needs to be persuasive, but it also has to be correct. And so, our general counsel is our general counsel. She literally represents us in all our legal matters, but she's also one of the most senior people, and she brings that piece to everything we do, and it's not not in her representation sense. It's more that she's really a gifted lawyer, and she makes our proposals better to private funders and things like that. Right. So I think I actually totally agree with the dean that these skills are transferable in so many different spaces. I think I knew I was not going to be a litigator forever. That was very clear to me. Maybe not in like the first couple years, but then I did leave my private job to go do direct service for a few years. But I didn't get joy from the litigation itself, or from like the really important and very unique skills of a litigator, sort of on your feet, during a deposition, or I could do it, but when I watched other people who got joy from it, and I could like see I was watching them, during a direct or a cross, it was like they weren't even there because their heads were just like in the direct and the cross, whereas I was more like, I want to be the person at the end who makes the great speech to the judge about why, you shouldn't do what I'm saying about this, custody case. So I think I picked up on that wasn't, there were other parts of my litigation work that I really liked, and I think it relates to policy stuff. I loved meeting with stakeholders. I loved investigations because I loved being out in the field, meeting people and getting their information, and being able to explain something, because that's another thing when you're going to be an advocate. You need to just like you need to advocate for your client in court, you also need to learn an issue to be able to advocate for a change in a city policy, you know? So I really, I stand with that most of it is transferable. Not so much some of the trial stuff was not for me, especially the contentiousness of it was, that's not something that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. What do you wish you had known in law school, or what skills do you wish you had been able to develop more to prepare you better, or do you feel like you got what you needed?
It was probably on the list, but I somehow missed that, so I'm like, let me think. I don't know if I have one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I actually think I would want, kind of going back to what I said about public versus private, like I wish I had known that it looks really different and it doesn't always have to be a certain way.
Yeah.
Because I think that on the one hand, I think doing policy work right out of law school of the type we're talking about, like working for an elected official or, in an actual like executive function or in a legislative function at any level, those jobs are harder to come by, I think, for recent law school grads. And it sort of reminds me of when I was in private practice that everyone said you couldn't go work at a general counsel's office unless you had worked at a firm.
Right.
And I think sometimes we need to just like get past that, that's always the way it is, because it isn't always that way. So I think that people should pursue, and I have met young lawyers, especially on the city council, smaller elected official offices, they'll often hire recent law grads who don't want to go into practice, and they know that, and they want to use their law degree in that way. So I think we should like push, I wish I had known that earlier to push against that. On the other hand, on the flip side, I do think that I don't have an answer, I don't know where I fall on it. I think there is real value in doing the work and representing clients and being in community or being, in family court all day or all different settings. I do think that there's value in that. But again, I think, in nonprofit settings, the same sort of like, you can't be in general counsel's office until you're at a firm. That all happens in nonprofit world too. It's like, we don't have policy people, we just have people who have to do everything. Like they have to represent clients in court, they have to go to Albany and advocate for legislative change, they have to sit on all the task force, they have to write the policy, like that. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I see a little movement in that because I think that that's just short-sighted, because they're Molly is a really good example of somebody who worked for me in a few capacities. Incredibly smart, amazing young woman. She would love that I call her a young woman because she's not that young anymore. Who worked for at least 10 years before she applied to law school. And she doesn't want to practice. She wants to do the kind of work that she was doing, but she wants to do it with a law degree. And I think she's going to do it. And she's, got into CUNY in this really prestigious fellowship program. And I'm like 100% sure she's not going to practice.
Right.
And she is too. And the people would be beyond lucky to have her in that capacity, even as a young grad. And that's a bad example, because you don't need to wait 10 years and then you're that person. That could be other people as well.
I mean, that's actually a great example, because sometimes students will come to me and say, I want to do public interest, I don't want to go to a law firm, for instance, but I don't necessarily want to do direct service work and have that be my whole career, because I'm concerned about things like sustaining myself and burnout and things like that. And so how do you see the options? I mean, we've talked about this before, about how it doesn't have to be law firm or public interest direct service, and you could do all of them. You don't have to do you don't have to do one or the other necessarily. I mean, what are some of your thoughts when people ask you about that too? I mean, that's something that I'm sure you talk to your mentees about.
I mean, I think one of the things I'd say about that is that as much as I'm like, we push against that, that's not true, you can't get those jobs. I think it probably is still challenging, but I also think it's a little bit like people who are at law firms who want to leave and go into the public interest world sometimes need to, you know, I think there's even like a technical term for it, like a sort of they need a bridge to get to the next place. And maybe that's true for people who don't want to practice but want to do policy work. Maybe you're not going to become, you know, the director of policy for an organization as a, you know, very recent law grad. But certainly, I mean, first of all, not to advocate too much for New York City, but there's so many jobs in city government that I'm shocked all the time. There's so many, you know, just policy analyst, policy advisor, and again, I couldn't tell you what that means because it looks so different from city agency to city agency. So I think it's a matter of, you know, both looking and pushing, but also recognizing that maybe you might need to do something first that's, you know, I don't know, with a law degree would seem isn't like senior enough, but maybe you need to do that. Just like being a staff attorney, you know, probably doesn't pay enough and is probably not senior enough for the amount of effort and sweat and tears that law students put into their education, but that's a stepping stone kind of thing, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I want to make sure to leave ample time for Q&A, but
Sure.
I do have one last more
Sure.
formal question, which is just, what do you see as, what have been the real opportunities for leadership growth for you in the policy space over the course of your career, and especially in the mayor's office?
Yeah, I think that relationships and asking questions and looking for help from people around you is probably something you hear in a lot of spaces like this, but it's really true. I always tell the story about, so you probably heard me tell it before, or others might have heard me tell it before, that when I was a first year, I applied for the Wank Fellowship, and I didn't get it. I applied to like so many things in law school that I didn't get.
That's a good lesson,
Just want to
too.
tell everybody that. I did a lot of good things too, but I didn't get it, and I was upset. And I don't know what made me do it, but I went to Dean Bouchou, who is no longer here, whose title at the time, I don't even know if I could tell you what it was, because there probably isn't an equivalent position now, so many years later. And I asked if I could meet with her, and I created a relationship with her based on the fact that I was upset that I didn't get it. Could she tell me why I didn't get it? And she gave me really frank feedback, and you know, and none, it wasn't like, you know, so negative that it, you know, it wasn't like that. It was more like she kind of gave me an understanding of sort of where I fit into this program and what other opportunities were there. And that, I always tell the story because, again, I don't know what made me do it. So that's why I want other people to hear it from me, because maybe I could have like woken up the next day and not done it. But I developed a relationship with her and other people within law school that that I think, you know, and sustained me after I left law school. I stayed friends with Dean Bouchou, which I should call her friend now. And I think those kinds of, you know, another Rutgers grad, Mary Beth Hogan, who's a partner at Devon Boys and Plimpton, who recruited me here. And if it hadn't been for her, I probably wouldn't have gone to a firm, to be perfectly honest. But she was very public interest oriented. She was a co-chair of PILF. I know now PILF, but at the time it was PILF. And she and I still communicate and connect. And one thing I've gotten involved with PILF, which is now the foundation part of PILSA, and I'm the chair of the board, which sounds a lot more exciting than it is because I'm the only alumni on the board, but I'm actively recruiting people to join me in this effort to help support the public interest work at the law school, which, to be transparent, I feel like alumni have done a bad job over the years of helping to support that work. I just think there's so much more we could be doing. And I reached out to Mary Beth, who better to help than a partner at a big firm in New York. So I think relationships, and in city government, oh my God, just remembering people, and I spend a lot of my time, and I do think that this helps in a lot of ways, just remembering people, remembering the work that they do. And I often am connecting other people, and so, like, I'll be in a certain space, and sometimes within a huge, you know, there's some city agencies in New York that literally have thousands and thousands of people who work there, and divisions that overlap and don't overlap enough and are siloed. And I'll often be like, oh, Suzanne, do you know Jen from this other division within the Department of Health? And she's like, no, I didn't. You're both doing commercial sexual exploitation work. And then I connect them. So I think, you know, being a person who values relationships and connections, I mean, that's true in anything you decide to do. But I think in these spaces, for sure.
I think there are a lot of other strands and themes that we could touch upon, but I do want to make sure there's
Sure.
enough time, and then I can sort of,
Yeah.
you know, ask some of my own questions as
Sure.
well, but a chance for people to ask.
Yeah, so actually going right off that, I wanted to know, you spoke a little bit right at the beginning about creating one-stop shops for our citizens. What does it look like to ensure that different departments are not replicating, replicating services? That way we're not wasting additional money that could be going to serving more people.
That's very hard, especially in New York City, because, especially right now, I think that we don't, there's so much momentum to get a lot of good done under this administration, and I'm so proud to be a part of it, but there's also a lot of momentum and things are moving quickly. So I think that is a pitfall of that. Although I'm sure, I think it always was an issue because just the sheer scale of things. I actually, it sounds kind of but I would say our office's role is actually really important for that because our job is to coordinate. And that never really existed before. So I think, you know, my boss right now, my commissioner, who I have to tell you is a social worker. I've never had a social worker as a boss, and she's the best boss I've ever had. So I always, you know, I think maybe I want to be a social worker in my dreams. I like an honorary degree. I've worked with so many of them. But she worked in Human Resource Administration, which actually now is called the Department of Social Services. That's another thing that happens in city government and in other government, like state, federal, like office names change a lot. They get restructured a lot, so it's hard to keep up. But she was a very senior executive in Department of Social Services. She oversaw all the DV the domestic violence shelters in the city, all of the what we call non-residential services that are funded, like nonprofits who get funding to do basically just not shelter, and a whole other lot of emergency intervention services. And she always says that she would constantly find out that other departments within DSS were like launching a DV thing, and she's like, wait a second, like that, you know, even within her department. So I do think that that's an issue, but I think it's about just exactly what I was talking about, is building relationships and collaborating and sort of, at least in New York City, and sometimes I feel bad when I'm in New Jersey because I know there's not enough. New Yorkers would never be willing to accept this, but I know because I work with both communities. We have so many more resources when it comes to addressing this issue than the people I know on the ground doing work in New Jersey, and so I think there's a lot of work to advocate for that in New Jersey. I forgot, I lost my train of thought. Hold on, I can say that. Yeah, I think I might have lost the strand, but it'll come back to me. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, you mentioned, you know, needing to do, or people thinking that you need to do direct service before you go into policy as a bridge. But I was wondering, do you think that not only is that the reputation of what you're supposed to do, but do you also think you really should do that because you can't really represent people in like a general policy way if you haven't worked with them directly in the practical? But do you think it's necessary?
We literally talked about this because I'm a little bit of two minds on that, because I do see the value of being on the ground, doing the work and working with clients. I think I have to admit that, especially when I'm in, you know, in sort of an educational space or in meetings with when I'm with my boss, with like commissioners of other departments or other things come up, I feel like I do like little things will come up, like, remember that client, remember, you know, and I probably sometimes don't get it exactly right, but it enables me to sort of speak some real, you know, specific anecdotes. So, but even though I say that, I don't think, I'm gonna push against that, because I do think that, I think it's short-sighted, because I think there's people who have a lot to contribute and who have done other kinds of work in other spaces, or who are teachers, or, you know, people's experiences, I think we should just push against that. Even though I see the value in it, so I think both could work.
As someone who is on the policy side of the table, what would be your advices to researchers whose topics may have policy implications? What they can do other than simply publishing so that the work has penetration to them?
I'm glad you brought up research and evaluation, because that's a really important thing I didn't talk about, probably because lawyers are not as good at that. And that's when I actually, one of my education programs, we were very short-staffed right now. I'm gonna come back to your question. We're really short-staffed, and there's a lot of bad hiring policies in city government, so it takes a really long time to get people into positions. And so we've had a real dip in our deliverables in one of these education programs that I didn't realize, because I wasn't looking, like I wasn't comparing month to month from year to year. I was just like, we did great in 2018. And I was just singing the praises of our research and evaluation team, because they're there to help support us in that way, but then they're also there because of what we were talking about. Like, of course, lawyers know how to research, but a lot of the work that I'm doing involves people who, you know, they've actually, you know, they're public health experts, and they understand certain scientific articles better than I, or at least they can distill them a lot quicker than I can. So, and I also think evaluation, to your point around sort of these various programs, is something we also haven't done enough of, because we want to help and we want to create these programs, and it seems like the right thing to do, but we need to do more evaluation. So, I mean, I think, you know, I actually think policy and research, at least in my agency, it's almost like they could be the same team. I think that we sort of, the small staff of mine that really are just dedicated to policy and not training and education, they're sort of like the think tank, you know, who bring these ideas to the researchers, who actually, they make us look good, because they get us all of the meat of what, you know, how we're gonna persuade a private funder or City Hall to actually go along with our program. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, I mean, publishing, you know, if you're a researcher and you're publishing, I think you still need to do that. But I think if you wanted to be, I think there is a lot of opportunity for people with strong research backgrounds who are actually researchers in the policy space, for sure. And more so than there used to be, because I think that people don't get away as much without evaluating things as they used to. Because honestly, I've been doing DV work for a really long time, domestic violence work for a long time, and none of the work that I was doing or the interventions we were using was evaluated, right? And now they are. So there's a lot more opportunity.
The funders really want that.
And funders really want it, but, and city, you know, like,
Yeah.
for the programs we're, yeah. And some of it's really hard to evaluate, I get it, but yeah.
When you're talking about evaluation, you're talking about evaluating the efficacy
Yeah.
of the programs.
Yeah. Other questions?
One more. So recently, it came to light that the Trump administration's Justice Department changed the definition of domestic violence to only include criminal acts. Is that going to impact your office at all? Does it mess with the?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's actually not true. I am gonna send you, I'll have you send around something so that, I mean, it, you know, there's so much that, it's still not a good thing, but I'm gonna tell you some specific things about it. But I just learned myself that, so the American Bar Association, and here's another great policy job opportunity. They have a commission on, and I won't get it right, but it's like the Commission on Domestic Violence, Trafficking, and Sexual Violence. I made that up, but something like that. And actually a really good friend of mine who was a prosecutor, who then became a domestic violence attorney in a civil context, and then ended up in Washington working she's the chair of this commission, that I should know the name of. And one of her colleagues sent around something on a lot of listservs yesterday. So the definitions that are on the website actually changed like in the spring, and nobody noticed, but it actually, so I happen to sit next to Bea Hansen, there's a long story here, who was the head of the Office of Violence Against Women office in Washington during the entire Obama administration. And even she saw the headline and was like, oh my God, and she forgot that. So a lot of things that were on the website were referencing definitions that we would use that are not what govern the work of that office under the Violence Against Women Act. So if you look at the definition in the Violence Against Women Act, which, you know, happened through the Victim of Crimes Act of 1996, whatever the, you know, the history behind it should come more quickly, but it, you know, it was completely tied to criminal justice. That's one of the biggest problems with the Violence Against Women Act. And the name, there's so many things about it that are so incredibly important and good, and it's done so much good, but there's a lot that could be examined around it. So jurisdictionally, everything is still governed by the definitions that are in the Violence Against Women Act, which have not changed. So it was truly just an administration that wanted, I mean, I can only guess that it was sort of like, we want to put what, probably because they like those, I don't know, don't quote me on that. I said that as Hannah, not as the, you know, city of New York, that they maybe wanted to be more specific because of whatever it is their agenda is, but the definition, they can't do that. That would require an act of Congress. So I'm here to tell you, everybody in New York thought that too, but it actually is not true. Does not mean that we shouldn't be vigilant and paying attention and watching how even just the changing of the website will impact our work. But it's actually, the definitions didn't change. And I'll send you the helpful, I just got it yesterday.
Clarification.
Yeah.
So you talked about learning to advocate within an organization in your time in private practice. Would you recommend looking for what other people are doing and seeing how you can be a part and improve and kind of push that forward, or coming and spearheading your own ideas that you're really passionate about, or is that based on where you're at in your career? How do you think about pushing policy forward?
I think that's a really good question. I think in 2019 that people expect young professionals to speak their minds and give their ideas. I do. I think that as like someone who's been around a long time, I'm even sometimes like taken aback by it, but I appreciate it. So I think I actually think both. I mean, I think we all could, you know, use more sort of paying attention to our peers and literally everybody, and supporting those around us, and sort of maybe seeing sort of an idea they have, or involving people earlier in a process. Like there's a lot of ways that I think that the way that organizations have always run are not, I think that not only did they not always support people with really good ideas, but I think it meant that we didn't do as good work. So I think I say that with, even though sometimes I'm like, but that's how it works. Like you can't, you know, you can't say, there are certain things that people say, I'm like, oh my God, I've never said that when I was like 3 years into my career. But I honestly think that, I think I couldn't possibly tell you not to advocate for the ideas that you have. I would just do it in a way that gives other people space too. I think it should always be that way though. You know, like I think that's how you should, you know, that's how you should operate generally. So it would be the same about sort of innovative ideas. I think that people expect people to, you know, come into spaces and both sort of support their peers and sort of, you know, lean back and sort of help support that, but they also expect people to take initiative and come to the table with ideas. So I would kind of do both.
You agree with that? Yeah, I do. I mean, and I actually wanted to pick up on one point that you're making, and I think that it also depends on the place that you are, the context, and what's most effective. And I think one of the skills that probably bridges and is going to be translatable in whatever space you're in is just that skill of collaboration. And there may often be opportunities where there are hubs and spaces within spaces that encourage that kind of collaboration. And I think that that skill is really cross-disciplinary and also cross-context. So when I talk to folks in, you know, who are working in specifically in a law firm context, that collaboration skill is really important. The public-private, really important. Doing it within a school, between school and another school. So I think that this question that you're asking is actually just also the right one, which is kind of a question about what's the most effective way to do things that I think need to happen. And, I mean, I always think about it as if I see a need and I think, okay, how can, in this context, you know, with regard to the thing that I think is the need that needs to be addressed, you know, what's the most effective way to do that, right? It's not always going to be the same with each issue, with each context, but I think that kind of openness, communication, and collaboration, those kinds of skills are really going to be, I think they're really, I mean, this is your time, so, but I do think that these are, when you talked about people expecting the emerging generations to actually speak up, I also think also there's an expectation of coming to the table with strong and very conscious skills that are probably not necessarily ones that have been taught so explicitly in the law school space in a more traditional sense. So this kind of more collaborative problem solving, identifying needs, trying to figure out how to work through systems to get things done. What you talked about regarding having to be knowledgeable about how to understand this research in these other spaces, right? That's also a skill that's important to be able to, and also to be able to ask questions, right?
Right, you have to do all those things and then also be someone who, like, you know, is quick and like turns things around and shows up, like all that other stuff that existed. I knew those things, but you're right. Do you know what I mean? Like the team members that I value the most, to be perfectly honest, have a lot of the traits that probably someone who predates me by 20 or 30 years would say, but I also think that the difference is that I also value a lot of other things. So it's not like we've taken away,
it's more.
just added.
More skills.
Which is a good thing though, because I do think that there's more, you know, it's a totally different time. I think I'm in my space right now, actually a lot of what I'm doing is advocating on behalf of the people that work in my department who, you know, have raised issues with how our organization is run and, you know, how are decisions made and what kind of communication that, you know, like that. So I just don't think there would have been, I don't think I would have been, and I'm definitely not addressing all the things that they've raised with me, but we've had some changes because of people bringing things to me and us moving it up the pipeline, and I just don't think that would have happened even like 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. Or at least not as quickly, you know. I just think there's a lot more appetite for sort of looking and seeing if this is the best way. Are we, you know, valuing everybody's input, all of those things. I think it's actually being well received in a lot of spaces. Not all spaces, but a lot.
I do think it needs an institutional level,
Yeah.
more consciousness about
Totally, yeah.
getting input and making sure that things are running, being responsive to other stakeholders.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Can we come full circle to your decision to come back to doing reconnect with that?
You mean after a private practice?
Yes.
Oh, I basically pretended like I was domestic violence lawyer the whole time I was a commercial litigator, so there was no like coming back to it. And actually, that's another thing I would, a piece of advice, that if you do end up in private practice, but you don't think that's where you're gonna stay forever, is continuing to build the relationships that you have with people in other spaces, so that when you want to make that shift. So when I did leave to go to Sanctuary, I'd done a lot of work with them. I knew the legal director really well, so I was able to like talk to her directly, and she already, because that's another, that like I said, that's a hard leap to go from a commercial setting to a nonprofit. I think there's sometimes some level of like, I don't really think you're gonna have the skills that we need, but if the person knows you and has seen your work or seen you in different spaces and you join stakeholder groups, then they'll know, and then you can make that jump easier. So yeah, no, I kind of always, the harder question for me to answer is really how I got sort of so focused on gender-based
how did
violence.
you?
I don't really know. I mean, obviously, it's interesting. I certainly had my own personal experiences, my own family experiences that I can reflect on now, but I certainly can't say that there was a direct connection at the time, that I was like, that's why I want to do this work. But I did want, I was a page in high school for my congressman. Like, I clearly wanted to like advocate for change, and I think as a woman, I clearly, a lot of that, often, it wasn't just, women's issues, but that was always a piece of it, and clearly gender inequities, which breed so much vulnerabilities and violence, was something I must have somehow seen it. But I don't know. It was, yeah, could have gone different ways. That's the other thing. It could have, like, your first summer job, like your first year, after first year, could have, I did actually go and do this work, and maybe that sealed the deal. Like, maybe if I'd taken a different job, it wouldn't have, you never know. Sliding doors, so different.
So what are you most excited about, the newest innovations in terms of the kinds of things that you're doing?
What am I most excited about? I'm excited, first of all, a lot more people are paying attention to the issue of gender-based violence, which is almost sort of startling if you've been doing work for a really long time. And I guess, I have to go back to what I said originally. I am excited about the sort of deeper, longer-term work around culture shifts, which I know is probably something that you and students talk about a lot in your clinic work. But I do think, I always say I have two daughters who are in middle school, and I feel like they have, at 11 and 13, like so much more knowledge than I ever had. And sort of, it's kind of both prevention and intervention. Like, I feel like they have more, my 13-year-old is, she's in 8th grade, which is like the most awful time in a person's life, as far as I can tell. And some days that's the way she acts, but she just, and I was like a really sort of passionate kid and had a lot of ideas, but I think both of them have more knowledge and have more of a voice to speak up for themselves and for other people than I think I ever did. Like, I feel like I've grown a lot in like the last 10 years, but when I was their age, like, I'm gonna do good, and but I wasn't really, I don't think I had a deep understanding of like the way our systems work and the different oppressions that people face. Like, and they already have a language to speak about that, So I think that's exciting, that, teaching young people to have that voice is exciting, but I also think even deeper is even just how we, how we can change the way we develop all the people in our society to stop all of the discrimination and harassment that so many people face. It's pretty depressing, but then when you think about the fact that you could actually teach like younger and younger kids certain things, that you could actually make a difference, that's kind of exciting. So I'm really passionate about my prevention work right now, and sometimes feel completely ill-equipped to do it because it's not my expertise at all. But it's amazing to support the teams that are doing it. I'm also particularly excited about how employers can get involved in these issues, and I feel like there's been a lot missing on that front. Maybe something for you to look into. I mean, Legal Momentum is an organization that I'm sure you work closely with and know all about.
You could do an externship with them.
You
through
could do
the
an
center.
externship with them. They probably haven't looked at it in a long time, but the last time they looked, it was 20% of employers across the country have an actual, I think they probably said domestic violence policy, which isn't what I would advocate for. I would say what people need is policies for gender-based violence. And I would say that New York City, which is where I work, doesn't have a policy. We all have, probably, I'm sure you've all had jobs, because of the federal laws around discrimination, there are EEO policies that refer to different victimizations and discrimination, but there's not an actual policy for a company that's like, this is how we're going to help support a person who's experiencing this, or this is how we're going to respond if an incident happens. Most companies don't have those. It's kind of like the prevention work in schools, because most people go to school and most people go to work. So if we, all of these issues are so underreported, so if people were being supported in their workspace and they weren't afraid that they'd lose their job, or like maybe they'd get more help and more support. So I'm sort of excited about how we can get employers involved in the work.
Please.
Oh, okay. In the very beginning, we were talking about how some people believe that all domestic violence is rooted in gender-based violence. I mean, this is like too broad of a question, but I kind of wanted to hear more about that.
Well, this is kind of this sort of policy challenge too, right, that you were alluding to in terms of how you frame things.
I mean, I think on a more simple level, people worry that we exclude men as victims when we talk about it that way, or people who identify as male. And so they sort of, most people can wrap their heads around it, but I do think that they're, sort of like the Violence Against Women Act, it's the same art, and I think it sounds simplistic, but I think when we think about gender, we probably think about it in a more expansive way, but most people think about it as a woman's issue. And so it's like gender-based violence obviously impacts people of all different identities, but then you have to like explain that. So I think it's more of an optics thing. Does that make any sense? It's like go into community and talk about gender-based violence. People think it's just, first of all, people won't know what you're talking about, but that it also is just an issue that impacts women when it impacts people of all gender identities. Does that help?
Yeah.
And they don't want to like have to get into but of course, they're, obviously the dynamics of intimate partner violence in a same-sex couple often are rooted in the same issues of patriarchy and misogyny, and maybe even in situations where a person identifies as a woman is the person causing the harm and the person they're harming isn't it. So you can you really could argue both ways on that. So that's the kind of thing, and I think they just think better to be more inclusive. Yeah.
I'd like to leave some time for people to talk to you. just
Yeah, of course.
one-on-one, Because that can also be really
Of course,
productive.
yeah.
So we also want to welcome folks to partake of the yummy snacks and coffee and tea. And thank you all so much for joining us,
Yeah.
especially on this freezing cold day.
Oh my gosh.
And Women's Law Forum for raising help as always. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And Hannah's actually going to be here for the People's Electric School Mixer. Is it Pilsen now? No, it's
So,
the PILF board.
It's PILF.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
PILF and PILF.
Pilsen and PILF.
Yeah.
And the Alumni Association.
And the Alumni Association,
Yeah.
which is exciting. A lot more people helping on the public interest front. Which is good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So please also join that.
Yeah.
Thank you.